Greetings friends, this video is a response to Jimbob and the Crucible and those people who I follow and I'm a big fan of. They've been talking about the white race and how it might not even be a real thing. And white nationalism is stupid, it doesn't make sense. And I agree with them on the second part. Well, white nationalism doesn't make sense. Where I have to disagree is that the white race is not really a real thing when you look closely. Now again, I don't want to straw man Jimbob or Posh or Andrew. Maybe I haven't listened enough, but here and there listening, that's the impression I got. So again, forgive me if I'm straw manning anyone, but they were saying things which I can agree with in themselves. Things that E. Michael Jones would have said about how there was no idea of being white before the settlement of North America. It was just you were English or you were Scottish or you were Italian or whatever. And yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think there's something to be said for a blurriness at the boundaries of the white race. Like, does it include the Mediterranean peoples? What about in Iran? Or in northern India, where they have like people with whiter skin than me, but they're not white. Are they white? Are they like, they're not European white? So yeah, I mean, I agree that there's going to be this complexity at the boundaries, but I don't think that something having blurry boundaries means that it's just a fake concept altogether. I think that's a bit of an error, and it puts me in a difficult position when it comes to evolution, because Jimbob talks about evolution. When the people who believe in evolution, they take a step back and he uses the analogy of a circle. You can't see. You can only see evolution if you remove yourself so far from it. But when you look closely, you don't see the mechanism for evolution. And I agree, that's true. But can we say in all cases that when you zoom in on something and you don't see the pattern anymore, therefore that pattern isn't there? I don't know. I think that actually might be a mistake in logic, because there are various ways we can talk about genetics, we can talk about history, culture, and again, I'm not saying it has to be all biology, but biology is certainly an important factor there. And the fact that we started thinking in terms of white and black in the last few hundred years, or Asian, thinking of races like this, because we were in a situation where maybe different nations were mixed together in the New World, and so we differentiated ourselves that way based on similarities that we had against other groups. That happening or not happening to me doesn't like disqualify the idea that there would be a race. And that's the thing. So maybe whiteness, yeah, it has a bit of murkiness to it. I'm willing to admit that. I'm not a white nationalist. I think that's silly. But are we gonna say that race itself is not really a real thing? I mean, we might say that philosophically, but in practice, like, if the police say, oh, like the suspect is a black male, or the suspect is a white male, or the suspect is an Asian woman, like, do you have any doubt in your mind as to what image, that gives you a framework to think about a person? It's based on our real experience. That's why we use it. That's why it's part of our language, at least to some extent. I think, for example, like, why, when I was growing up in a multicultural, environment, and, in junior school and middle school and high school, there were Somalians, there were Asians. Again, I'm using the, race because, well, let's just stick to nation, okay? There were Pakistanis, there were Indians, Koreans, Serbians. Why is it that I ended up being, most of my core group of friends ended up being people from a European background? Like, obviously we're Canadians, but why is that? Like, I mean, you could say, oh, well, it's, you know, the leftists, they would have their own explanation. They would say, oh, well, you know, that's you know, your cultural influence. I mean, and the leftists, they believe in race too, but then they also try to deconstruct race. So they have a more incoherent take on race. They say, oh, well, whiteness isn't real, but white people are oppressing everyone. So whatever. But I would agree that race exists, and I'm giving you examples like in law enforcement, in terms of, you know, naturally who you get along with. That's culture. You could say, oh, well, that's your culture. Your culture is gonna bring you together with other people. Yes, but every culture must have some biological framework to it. You can't separate the two. You could argue that culture is more important. I believe that Christianity does bring all the races of the world together, but the race is certainly a factor there. Listen to Dr. Edward Dutton. He's someone I would disagree with on many things, like he believes in evolution and all this stuff, but he can definitely elucidate the concept of race better than I can. It's a real scientific discipline, unlike a lot of the nonsense which is out there in the scientific community. Race is taken very seriously by scientific thinkers, and it has for some time. And a lot of this did happen with the colonial period, particularly the Germans in the pre-war period. They were lovers of culture, and I'm talking like late 19th century, early 20th century, before the wars. Like, they documented people, that they documented biological characteristics of people. It is a serious field. So when it comes to white nationalism, Jimbob makes the point that, like, well, how are we going to have, you know, you can't base everything on race. Then you'd end up letting in all these crazy white people, because the white race is so divided, and like the division of the white race is taken as to say that, well, there, you know, it's not a concept you can take seriously. Being white, you can't take it seriously, because look at all these leftists, look at all these degenerates. And he has the idea of Suffering Sally. Suffering Sally is his, like, stereotypical character of the leftist white woman. She wants to be a moral busybody, correct you, and she's miserable. That's why she's suffering, and she wants to be nosy, and the question he poses is that, well, if you're trying to make your white nation and try your better world, your better community, to escape all the stuff that's wrong with the world, but you're founding it on white nationalism, you would have to let Suffering Sally into your community, into your citadel, into your city, because on your logic she's white, and she's so you got to let her in. And I agree, this does illustrate the terrible problem facing white people. Again, if white people is even a thing, and I wouldn't let Suffering Sally in. I might say jokingly, oh yeah, you can let her in, but no, I mean, we can't. Half of the white race is beyond reconciliation. But my point is that this is a tragedy, because we do have the same ancestry to some extent. We share a common ancestry, and you can nitpick with details and say, oh, well, you know, maybe we don't, because maybe the different classes in England, maybe they had, you know, different genetics, and they did, and sure, but over hundreds of years, you know, I don't believe in evolution at all, but over hundreds of years, there are, you know, there's certain genetic characteristics, just ways of personality, ways of thinking, art forms, ways of using language. I mean, it's not, again, you could say, well, that's all just culture. Yeah, it is culture, but there's always this biological matrix which culture is intertwined with. I agree, religion is the most important thing. Religion is the font from which culture flows, and culture then informs politics. Yeah, I agree. We can all agree on that. But I mean, when I hear this talk of like, what is white? What is it? What is it? What does that even mean? Like, what is well, if you ended up in prison, you would find out what being white is very quickly. If you go to Africa as a non-African, let's say as a quote-unquote white person who questions what whiteness is, if it's even a real thing, well, if you go to Africa, you're going to find out what whiteness is very quickly. We're going to find these things out in our daily practical life. Not everything has to be completely clear and lucidly defined and measurable at a microscopic level. There are patterns we can recognize, and our enemies certainly recognize them. And then they say, oh, well, you're playing into the game of the enemies. They want us to be divided, you see. Well, I guess that does happen, yeah, with these white nationalists, but you don't have to be a white nationalist to recognize that white is a real thing. And in some cases, for your own well-being, you may as well recognize it, that white is a real thing. And while you're at it, you could probably recognize that blacks are a real race too, and so are Asians to some extent. And you could go on, and where you draw the line, yeah, sure, that's a discussion we could have. Is Mexican a race, or are they all just Latinos? I mean, yeah, there's always going to be some room for discussion, but I don't think that means that there aren't races in the world. And if I do recall correctly, St. Paul mentions different peoples in the world, and I think the wording he uses is each according to his clime, like climate or geographical area. Those are my thoughts on the matter. Hasta luego, amigos.